Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Nice to see a full room here to talk about regulatory proceedings. Hope you guys are in for a thrilling talk. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to make it fun. Mike brought candy, so we're good. My name's Jessie Burley. I'm the Town of Breckenridge Sustainability and Parking Manager. Thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you guys for being here in Breckenridge today. It's really exciting to see this event grow over time, and really in this political space to just have so many people who are still doubling down and committing to being both here in community and doing the work. So thank you. So we're going to talk about the power. Whoops. Oh, this is sensitive. Okay. We're going to dive in. Oh my goodness. I know. I'm trying. Here we go. I'm going to let our speakers introduce themselves. I did not touch it that time. Oh, great. Okay, so quick, Sarah, your turn.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Judkins. I'm an attorney at Kaplan Kirsch, located in Denver, and we were fortunate to represent the Mountain Community Coalition in the Mountain Energy Project proceeding that we're here to discuss today.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Mike Foote. I'm an environmental attorney. I do environmental law and policy for my own firm. And I typically represent environmental nonprofits, local governments, trade associations, those types of groups in front of agencies like the Public Utilities Commission, Air Quality Control Commission, et cetera, which you're going to hear a lot about today. Before that, I was in the state legislature doing energy policy, and before that, I was a prosecutor. And Jessie mentioned that I brought candy. Candy is a reward for folks to ask questions. Like, not that I hear you don't need those types of rewards, but nevertheless, we'll do a little pre-Halloween candy for you. So if you ask a question, you get a piece of candy. And if you stump one of us, you get another piece of candy. So just FYI at the end.
I am already stumped by my own slide deck, so I'm really sorry about this, you guys. So really quickly, we're going to overview the regulatory opportunity, how local governments can play a role in this space. We'll talk a little bit about resource considerations. So as you embark on perhaps some engagement in the regulatory space, what kinds of resource considerations might you need? We'll use the Mountain Energy Project as an example. It's a particular public utility proceeding here in Colorado with Xcel Energy, and we'll use that to kind of walk through an example. Talk about, wow, that's super annoying. Building coalitions, actions and outcomes of the Mountain Energy Project, and then other spaces for regulatory engagement. So that's what we'll talk about today. And over to you, Mike.
Okay, so I'm going to give a pretty quick introduction here. Jessie did mention we're going to be talking a lot about public utilities commissions, and that's probably 90% of what we'll talk about. There's other agencies, though, that are part of the states when they determine regulations for those states that we'll briefly mention. But in general, with the Public Utilities Commissions or an Air Quality Control Commission, et cetera, I kind of see these agencies as some of the most powerful state agencies that nobody has heard of. Nobody really knows, at least no normal people know, what a Public Utilities Commission does for the most part. And I put myself in that category of being very abnormal. And the way that I try to explain it to normal people that don't do this every day is if you travel down to Arizona and you notice that there's no solar panels on any rooftops, why is that? It's one of the sunniest places on earth. It's because of their Public Utilities Commission and the rules that they've implemented and what they've ended up doing or not doing or making the utilities do or not do. So these types of agencies, including PUCs, have a lot of discretion and a lot of power. Local governments can have a very high impact on what these agencies like the PUCs do. What I've found is that PUCs want to know local governments' opinions on matters, particularly if those local governments are a part of the filing, like in this filing that you're going to hear about more today. But even if not, even if they just have a general interest in, say, emissions reduction or transportation electrification or the host of other issues in front of these PUCs, they still want to hear what the local governments have to say. And so there's a very good place for local governments in these that can make both a positive difference, a positive difference in making the plan the utility puts forth better, or it can be a little defensive or very defensive in trying to make the plan the utility puts forward a little less bad. But either way, there's a very good place and a role for local governments in the PUCs. Next slide. So
maybe.
Is this the next slide?
Now, we're having some technical difficulties with the slides, so thank you guys for bearing with us, but this is not the next slide. Kim, can you drive us?
I'm seeing what I don't know anything back here. See what I can do.
I'm not even touching anything when it goes. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, sure.
We'll figure this out.
I don't think public utilities commissions have control over slideshows, though, so we'll just kind of exclude that from this conversation. So I'll just kind of tell you about the Public Utilities Commission in Colorado in general. And apologies, I'm sure there's folks in this room that are not from Colorado. I'm most familiar with the Colorado PUC, although I practiced in front of Minnesota and New Mexico as well, but not many of these states represented in this room probably. But I think that many of the things that we talk about when it comes to the Colorado PUC are applicable throughout all the states that are represented in this room. So the bottom line for the PUC's scope in Colorado and other states is pretty much whatever the investor-owned utility and other utilities, depending on jurisdiction, do has to go through the PUC. So from soup to nuts, when the utility wants to do something that's under the PUC's jurisdiction, they have to ask the PUC, and the PUC has to ask others what they think before they make a decision about what the utility is going to do. And so now in Colorado, it's the investor-owned utilities like Xcel and Black Hills that are under direct jurisdiction. There's other utilities that have the PUC has partial jurisdiction over for some things. But even if they don't have partial or direct jurisdiction, the decisions made at the PUC still has impacts on things like municipal utilities and rural electric associations that aren't under the direct jurisdiction of PUC, because really when you're talking about the investor-owned utilities in Colorado, that's the vast majority of the customers here. And so it has impacts throughout the entire state. But the PUC, and this is subject to local governments and their land use authority in the various states, but the PUC can determine things that run the gamut, like, are you going to have a big gas plant next to your town? Are you going to have a transmission line that runs through your county? What are your constituents' rates going to be? What are your rates going to be, because you're a consumer of electricity as well? How profitable the utility is. In Colorado and other states, I know that there's been a real focus lately on wildfire prevention and mitigation to try to prevent, if possible, utilities sparking wildfires, which of course everybody knows has a huge impact on local jurisdictions. So all of those things and more are things that the utilities determine through their oversight of the investor-owned utilities, and I should say the PUC determines over their oversight of IOUs. I'll also tell you that the PUC has really wide discretion about how to do these things. Their direction from the legislature is typically very broad. So like I said, I was in the legislature for 8 years. I did energy policy. I ran bills and voted for bills that basically said, hey, utility, you have to reduce emissions by 80% by 2040. So just go do it. And that's pretty much what the bill said. And the PUC then has to determine how they're going to make the utilities do it. So think about the scope of that issue, just that issue, and all the options and the difficulties of that, and that gives you an idea of how the PUC has to approach their job every day. Okay, next one. So it is working, excellent. So I'll just very briefly go over process. This can take forever, just like anything in front of the PUC, so I'll just do the very broad highlights. But the way that most actions, if not all, start in front of a PUC is the utility has to file some kind of a plan. So it would be like an electric resource plan or a transportation electrification plan, a gas infrastructure plan, a rate case. It runs the gamut, but it starts with them filing it. Then interested parties, those would be like local governments, consumer advocates, and others, which I'll go over in just a minute on the next slide. They intervene in the action. So they say, we want to be a party to this, and the Public Utilities Commission will typically say, okay. So they become a party. And then the next phase is the discovery phase, which is a very valuable phase, because I think anyone that's dealt with utilities knows they are not always very forthcoming when answering questions from local governments and consumers and others. But in the discovery process, they have to be. So you can ask any relevant question to that proceeding, and the utility has to answer the question. And so you'll see in these, the parties will ask hundreds of questions and do hundreds of data requests depending on the size of the proceeding. And they'll get answers back from the utility. This is a great spot to do that, and that's what a lot of parties do, including local governments. And so after the discovery period is over, more or less, then the parties then file what's called answer testimony. So they're answering what the utility has put forth. And the intervening parties then say, this is what we like, this is what we don't like, here's what we think you should do instead, et cetera. The utility gets a chance to file rebuttal. After the rebuttal period, that's most of the paper that's been filed on the case. It can run hundreds of pages per party. There's expert witnesses that come in and file affidavits typically for parties. Then the all-important settlement discussions and negotiations begin. I would say 90%, if not more, of these cases result in a settlement proposal to the PUC. It's encouraged actually in the PUC rules in Colorado to come to a settlement. The catch is you have to be an intervening party in order to participate in the settlement discussions. So members of the public, even local governments that are not an intervening party, are not going to have a seat at the table during the settlement discussions. Settlement discussions are wide-ranging, and they often determine what the PUC ends up doing. In Colorado, the PUC has lately shown an ability to just reject settlements or heavily modify settlements. That's fine. Sometimes they accept them or change them a little bit, but it really does set the tone of discussion how these settlements come out. So once a settlement is reached, if there is some kind of a partial settlement or a unanimous settlement amongst the parties or whatever the case may be, can run the gamut again, then the commission goes through an evidentiary hearing. The evidentiary hearing is cross-examination of witnesses. The commissioners get to ask questions of everybody, including the utility. And then when that's over, all the parties have to file their statement of position, saying what they think the commission should do, what they shouldn't do, all those types of things. The commission ultimately decides. There's an appeals process, an appeals period, and then they really decide at the end of those appeals processes. So if that sounds like that could take a long time, that you're right. I would say like the average time for one of these proceedings is 9 to 12 months. Could be longer for a more complex proceeding. I've been involved in a Minnesota proceeding that's been open since 2016. There's one in Colorado that I'll talk about a little bit later, the electric resource plan that started in 2021. So these things can go on for quite some time, and it takes perseverance and resources from local governments and others to stay involved. But if they're not involved, then big decisions are being made without them. So I would certainly encourage you to be involved. Okay, I have one more slide. Who can participate? So I'm going to start off and just with the number 3 on this slide, just to mention that members of the public are definitely invited and encouraged to participate. The way that it shakes out with the Colorado PC at least is that takes the form of 2 to 3 minute comments during comment sessions, like before the evidentiary hearing, for example, virtually, so that anyone around the state can participate without having to travel. Sometimes the PUC commissioners take the show on the road and go to impacted communities and take comments like they did in this case that we'll discuss. And so public comments are encouraged, and they should be getting public comments to get a good general sense of what the public is thinking. But I can't say that I recall off the top of my head the times during deliberations when the commissioners are deliberating on the Zoom where they discuss anything other than the intervener positions. So they'll typically say, okay, intervener X wants this, intervener Y wants that, the utility wants this. This is what we think should happen. And then they'll kind of take a straw poll vote and, move on. So public participation is great, but really to have an impactful role, it really needs to be in the form of an intervening party if at all possible. And so they include local governments, they include consumer groups, they include major consumers, they include trade associations, like pretty much anyone can be an intervening party if they have some kind of relevant stake in the game. So that's pretty liberally construed. So anyone can do it. Local governments I've never seen a local government be denied intervening status. Okay, I think that's it. Hope I didn't go over my time, Jessie.
Perfect, thanks. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about resource considerations if a local government or a coalition of governments wants to do what Mike just described, and that is intervene in a particular proceeding. And so obviously we are local governments, we're resource constrained, we have staff capacity, we have technical capacity, restraints, et cetera. And so all of those things play a role in the consideration of whether or not to engage. But when we're talking about big climate issues, these are big decisions. And like Mike said, if we're not at the table as an intervening party, submitting just public comment a lot of times, might raise an issue, but it's not gonna get the commissioner's attention to really drive that outcome and change. So you're looking at financial considerations, budget constraints. This is something that I think, as the economy turns, is certainly something that's all on the forefront of our minds. Technical and legal expertise, you might have project managers, but maybe not somebody who has legal experience at the Utility Commission or even just staff technical experience, because a lot of these proceedings are quite technical in nature. And then the capacity to engage. A lot of us, how many of you are staff and you're a one-person show? Okay, oh, well, sorry for you, Sarah, but that's good that there's other people here that have teams of folks, but we are often staff constrained as well, so these are things to consider along the way. Apologies for the formatting. Benefits of coalitions then would be, you have the opportunity to goal set across jurisdictions. So it's not just one jurisdiction talking, but rather a coalition, and those goals have an elevated position, much like the community that we've built here sharing those common goals allows us to have a bigger voice. Resource pooling, you can divide and conquer, you can contribute at different levels, and make sure that you have the ability to engage at the level that is really necessary to do the work. And then, of course, just the advocacy at the end of the day, more jurisdictions saying the same thing is going to drive bigger change. All right, so we'll turn it over to Sarah, who's going to describe specifically for us the Mountain Energy Project.
Thanks. So the focus, I guess, or an example that we're going to discuss more in depth today is the Mountain Energy Project, which was a recent Public Utilities Commission proceeding here in Colorado. As Mike described, it was an application filed at the Public Utilities Commission by Public Service Company of Colorado, or Xcel, to address a peak hour demand supply shortfall here in Summit County and other parts of the Central Mountains. They sought to avoid a $300 million investment in a new natural gas pipeline from the Front Range to provide natural gas service throughout the Eastern Mountain gas system through a plan that included several components, including a supplemental gas supply of $78.6 million, a non-pipelines alternative portfolio of $48.7 million, and $28 million for electric distribution system upgrades needed to implement the NPA portfolio. And a key piece, as discussed on the last slide, was the non-pipeline alternatives, or NPA measures, which are measures that can defer, reduce, or eliminate the need to construct or upgrade components of a natural gas system through reducing the demand for natural gas. This can include electrification measures and measures that address demand for natural gas. So, for example, NPAs might include incentives for appliance upgrades, building envelope measures, demand response programs, and beneficial electrification.
So this slide gives you an example of what the Eastern Mountain gas system is and what region of Colorado we're talking about. It's illustrative here, but you can see it goes all the way from Grand Lake and Granby in the north, south towards Breckenridge, and even bits of it over Hoosier Pass into Buena Vista. But the real conundrum that Xcel was proposing in their filing was the fact that the Keystone leg and the Breckenridge leg really had a significant shortfall on the coldest days of the year. And so they refer to design day as a particular parameter of negative 39 degrees. And it's that coldest hour of the coldest day that we're talking about gas shortfall. And so even within those assumptions, I see some eyebrows going up like, oh, does it really get to negative 39 degrees? So there just becomes some questions that as impacted communities, we want to have more answers to. And so that really kicked off the coalition. You can see here the members of the Mountain Community Coalition. We had Summit County government the towns of Breckenridge, Silverthorne, Frisco, Dillon, Blue River, and Keystone. So it's all kind of centered right there around the Lake Dillon region. So I already talked a little bit about the importance of building coalitions, but for us, I'll just talk about some of the details. So as mentioned, we have staff capacity constraints, and so you really want to make sure you have the subject matter expert, your local government official, the person who's going to take the lead and really be able to apply your local goals or the impacted nature of what this application would do on your community and be able to bring that local voice forward. At least in Colorado, for sure, you want legal counsel. That's why these folks are here sitting next to me. Kaplan Kirsch represented the Mountain Community Coalition, and then Mike was outside counsel for Summit County Government, and together we all made up the Mountain Community Coalition. And then we also hired Synapse Energy Economics. They're a firm out of Massachusetts, and they were really our technical experts. And so they did the deep dive on the analysis. They were able to provide us with alternatives, other suggestions that we could put forward in our recommendations and our testimony. And in fact, Synapse did have a witness as part of our coalition that actually provided testimony as well. So we would not have been able to participate and engage at the level that we did without Synapse and their expertise. So once we formed the coalition, we wanted to make sure we were all on the same page related to goals. And so it was really important for us to outline what those were and all get on the same page. And it allowed the project team to have the authority to go into discussions without having every member of the coalition at the table and really get behind these goals. So we had very clear climate goals. All of the communities within the coalition share the same regional climate action plan. And so it was very easy to point to that plan and those goals to start the climate discussion. We have concerns about affordability. Like many of you, we live in mountain resort communities, and affordability in general is already a challenge. And so you add energy affordability on top of that, and that's a major consideration. We heard this morning from one of our speakers that the cost of fuel and the cost to electrify is really, it's a no-brainer when you go towards electrification. And so while first costs might look a lot scarier in time, those costs really trickle down to the ratepayer, which is super important. And then the resilience piece. So we had one member of the coalition in particular who was very concerned about just resilience of the electrical grid. They had some recent history where the electrical grid had gone down for various reasons. A squirrel may or may not have been one of them. But it was a consideration and something that we brought forward and really wanted to get behind. I would say that the resilience piece is largely tied to wildfire, but just in general, making sure that what infrastructure is there is resilient and keeps the lights and the heat on. And then finally, the rationale. It's very easy to look at the price tag of something like this, and taxpayers go like, "What am I getting out of this?" But we really wanted to make sure that as impacted communities, there was a lot of chatter and a lot of, I would say, confusion from the public about what the project actually was trying to do and what it wasn't trying to do. And even when there was the price tag that was put forward, which was half of what traditional infrastructure would have been, there was still kind of this sticker shock. And so we really wanted to make sure that not just on affordability, but that the community goals were well represented in the discussion. We also wanted to ensure and elevate, frankly, the level of transparency of the project within the community and make sure that there was a two-way street of communication and outreach from both the utility and local governments and what we were able to represent in that. And then finally, accountability and making sure that these projects that the utility is putting forward both meets their goals and their statutory requirements as well as our own, because we know that we won't be able to achieve our climate goals without the help of the utility either. So back over to Sarah to discuss some of our efforts.
So I'll walk through briefly kind of how the Mountain Community Coalition participated in the process that Mike described earlier. As we've talked about, the Mountain Community Coalition was an intervening party in this proceeding and had the opportunity to submit extensive discovery on Xcel's application for this project. Synapse, as Jessie said, was incredibly helpful in that process in breaking down a lot of the technical information and details and assumptions and modeling and really probing those topics. We submitted 2 rounds of written testimony from Jessie on kind of policy-related issues and from Synapse on more technical-related issues. And that really set the stage for the settlement negotiations that followed in terms of finding areas where different parties had some levels of alignment, where Xcel was willing to compromise, where parties were willing to compromise, to kind of come together with all parties except for one in the proceeding to ultimately reach a comprehensive settlement that addressed all of the issues that were at play in this proceeding. After we got to a settlement, filed that with the commission, there was still an evidentiary hearing where parties provided testimony, were cross-examined by other parties, were asked questions by the commission, by the hearing commissioner in this case. And because of the settlement agreement, it revolved in large part around whether the commission should accept, modify, or reject the settlement, with 7 out of 8 or 8 out of 9 parties all supporting the settlement agreement that had been reached amongst Xcel, the Mountain Community Coalition, several environmental organizations, the staff of the Public Utilities Commission, and the Energy Office for the state of Colorado. So it was really a diverse group of parties that came together, which I think helped gives the settlement agreement in this case strength, and that it's not just kind of one viewpoint that was kind of brought others along, but it was really a compromise that was worked out over a number of negotiating sessions. And I will say, given the position of the Mountain Community Coalition as the impacted communities in this case, I think had a particularly elevated voice, both at the evidentiary hearing and in settlement conversations, because these are the communities that will experience the result of this proceeding. So after the evidentiary hearing, we filed our statements of position, our policy/legal briefs at the beginning of September, and we're still waiting for a decision from the commission. So we don't know the outcome yet. The commission does have the authority to accept, modify, or reject the settlement agreement. We think we've put forward a really compelling settlement agreement that's well supported by the evidence in the case and numerous parties, but we'll see what they do.
Maybe we'll have a 2.0 next year. We'll give you the results.
So diving a little bit more into the settlement agreement, I think we were really able to reach a settlement agreement that aligned with a number of goals of the Mountain Community Coalition. So the settlement agreement accelerates the adoption of NPA measures. So really getting those electrification and building envelope measures off the ground in the near term, starting this year, to help, decrease the demand on the gas system and hopefully reduce the need for additional gas infrastructure and gas need over the coming years. The next was that Xcel has committed to propose an electric heat pump pilot program for rates to help remove some of the affordability barriers. In addition to the upfront cost of installing a heat pump, of course, your heating cost will now show up on your electric bill, and that can be an increased cost, particularly in the winters in the Mountain Community Coalition communities. We're also able to negotiate a downsize of the proposed LNG supplemental supply facility here in Breckenridge, or Breckenridge-ish.
Greater Breck.
Yeah. Which also had the effect of decreasing the cost of the project by several $1 million. And I think another key component was the development and outreach and education that the parties developed and agreed to. So there'll be an NPA working group that includes members of the Mountain Community Coalition, Xcel, community members, nonprofit organizations, anyone who wants to participate and help roll out the NPA program to be as successful as possible. I think from the Mountain Community Coalition's perspective, like having on the ground voices and understanding how to roll out a program like this effectively in the impacted communities is really helpful and essential to the program's success. And then finally, and this was a key goal of the Mountain Community Coalition, was maintaining an equitable cost recovery for this project. So typically utilities put all of their costs into base rates, and that's spread across all of the customers across their service territory. The commission one commissioner had expressed some interest, and then the state utility consumer advocate kind of picked this up of somehow allocating the costs of this project only to customers in the Eastern Mountain Gas System, which of course would have a huge impact on customers' bills in this area. And as part of the settlement agreement, all of the parties agreed that no, that's not the right approach here. Cost recovery should proceed as it usually does and should be spread across all of Xcel's customers across its service territory in Colorado. So that's a key affordability and kind of equitable argument. We had both technical and policy arguments to support that approach to cost recovery, and hopefully the commission picks that up. And so as I discussed a little bit earlier, one key element of the settlement agreement is rapid deployment of the NPAs. NPAs, are a no-regret solution. They provide opportunities for customers to save money through energy efficiency measures. They can reduce greenhouse gas emissions through electrification, and they can avoid huge investments in natural gas infrastructure through conservation and reduce demand for natural gas through demand savings programs as well as electrification. And I think from my perspective, at least this and the Mountain Community Coalition, this is the future of gas planning as we're trying to move off the natural gas system and towards electrification. And it's also our understanding that this is the largest NPA proposal across the country. So huge kudos to Xcel for coming up with this proposal in this portfolio to avoid the investment in the natural gas system.
And I would just add, because it is the largest, or perhaps one of the largest, it's really, really important for the local communities to feel like there's success here. Like we don't want the first large NPA program to tank and then everybody else across the country be like, oh, that doesn't work. So we really want to make sure. So we have offered and have brought forward like the partnership on our end to say, hey, Xcel, like we are here to help you roll this out. How are we going to do it? What is the best approach? Who are the partners in the room? And so that's really, really, really important to us, both for it to work here and for us to meet our goals, but also really on behalf of you all who might have NPAs proposed in your communities as well. All right. So Mike's going to talk about the importance of the interconnectedness of proceedings, and then also other regulatory spaces that might be available to local government.
Yeah, thanks, Jessie. We're almost done, and then it's candy time. Yeah. What we've talked about so far, the MCC is a great example. There's many other types of proceedings in front of the PUC. A couple that I'll mention that have come before the Colorado PUC, at least over the last couple of years, that local governments have been involved with and have made a big difference in, include number one, the Transportation Electrification Plan, which is a result here in Colorado, at least, of a bill that was passed in 2019 requiring Xcel and to come up with a plan to build out transportation electrification infrastructure. So every 2 years they come out with a plan. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that's spent on electrification infrastructure. The overall goal is what Governor Polis has said several years ago for almost 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. So you have to have the infrastructure to support that. And local governments have been constructively involved in the transportation electrification plans, mainly to make sure that their jurisdiction gets a lot of this infrastructure, or in some cases to make sure that income qualified or disproportionately impacted communities gets their or more than their fair share of this type of infrastructure. Multi-unit housing gets its fair share of this infrastructure. So we're not just seeing fast chargers in a couple of places along the highway, but also in communities or level 2 chargers. So local governments have had an effective voice to make sure that's spread around and that those areas can receive a good portion of the infrastructure that's going to be built by the utility. Electric resource planning is something that happens every 3 to 5 years, depending on the plan, depending on the state, where the utility comes forth and it says, this is what we think the demand is going to be over the next several years. this is how we're going to fulfill the demand by building X number of new gas plants or solar installations or wind installations, batteries, et cetera. This is really where everything kind of comes into place as far as emissions reduction, or at least a large part of it. And it will result in things like, where are these gas plants being built, or how many gas plants are being built, or when will a coal plant be shut down, or how long will it stay open? Those types of things are decided in an ERP, an electric resource plan. And in Colorado, since 2019, there's been the just transition legislation that was passed, where communities that have had coal plants and that will be getting the coal plants shut down earlier than expected will be getting community assistance that come from the ratepayers, but at least it goes to the communities to help at least make up for some of the loss of revenue and tax revenue for the early closure of those coal plants. So, of course, those communities want to be involved and have been involved in the electric resource plan. That was the 2021 plan that I referenced earlier. It's still open, and it's kind of, I guess, brother or cousin, the just transition solicitation that was open in 2024. Again, local governments have played a very important role in those, and they should, because it's a big part of emissions reduction and also just keeping the lights on and reliability. So I'll mention also, I guess maybe I should have said next slide. Other regulatory venues, just I'll mention very quick. It's not just about the PUC, although it's very important to be involved with the PUC. In Colorado and other states, they have, there we go. They have Air Quality Control Commission in Colorado. It's different names in other states, but controlling air quality, or at least rules around air quality. Here in Colorado, we have the Denver Metro North Front Range ozone non-attainment area, which is a continuous problem. And the Air Quality Control Commission's job, among other things, is to try to get that area into compliance for ground level ozone. And in short, I think Sarah's going to talk about this in just a minute and go into a little more detail about AQCC. But in short, at least in Colorado, your constituents in your local government could be subject to AQCC regulations if you have a building that's over 50,000 square feet in your jurisdiction, or if you have a landfill, or if you have an oil and gas facility, or if you have some kind of a facility that emits benzene or hydrogen sulfide or hexavalent chromium or a couple of other toxic air contaminants, which, like a shortcut is saying, pretty much everywhere is affected by these regulations. And so that's important in order to be able to shape those, because even if you're just regulating air toxics, that does not necessarily have a climate impact, but often it does, really, because it's a co-benefit of reducing emissions of, say, benzene, that you're also reducing emissions of GHGs, and vice versa. So being involved in those is important. And finally, I'll just mention in Colorado, we have the Energy and Carbon Management Commission, which used to be called the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Now the ECMC does things like geothermal. They have jurisdiction over oil and gas operations both above and below ground. Here in Colorado, I think a fairly unique twist is that local governments also have concurrent siting jurisdiction over oil and gas facilities, but it's all above ground jurisdiction. So for things like below ground, like, hey, you really need to plug this well, or there's rules for plugging and abandonment so the well doesn't just stay open for 30 years and take all that property off limits to development for the local government, for example. Those types of things go through the ECMC. And local governments here have been more and more involved with those proceedings. And just like the PUC, the local government perspective is important, and it's welcomed, and it's taken seriously in my experience with the ECMC. So I think I'll just pass it off to Sarah real quick to talk a little bit more about the AQCC, and I think we get into Q&A, right?
Yeah, just a few additional comments on the AQCC. So we also represent local governments frequently before the Air Quality Control Commission, often in coalition similar to the Mountain Community Coalition. And as Mike mentioned, the AQCC regulates air quality in Colorado, so including emissions of greenhouse gases. And so local governments often advocate before the AQCC on better controls, for example, for methane from oil and gas operations, to regulations to address greenhouse gas emissions from industry and manufacturing, and other sources to address air toxics. And there's kind of overlapping co-benefits, as Mike mentioned. So an ozone proceeding might also have significant greenhouse gas impacts. And so I think communities and local governments have an opportunity to participate, both as regulated entities, as Mike was mentioning, but also to kind of advance climate goals, advance air quality goals, and kind of public health goals as well.
And I'll just add a different type of plan in front of the Public Utilities Commission that might impact a lot of you out west is our wildfire plans. And so a lot of utilities are turning towards looking at how to plan for wildfire resiliency and what that, how that impacts the grid, et cetera. And I think that that's another space where local communities absolutely should have a voice at the table. We heard again from one of the speakers this morning just about the cost of energy in California and how everyone likes to try to point to renewables, but really it's the impacts of wildfire and what that does to the utility costs. So that's just another example of a type of proceeding that you might want to, have your eye on or engage with.
Yeah, just a little follow up on that. Xcel just finished up its first wildfire mitigation plan before the Public Utilities Commission. And there was, I believe, a comprehensive settlement that came out of that, and the local governments that participated, I wasn't involved in this, but appeared to have, very influential role in those settlement negotiations because they basically got everything they were asking for out of that settlement agreement, which was approved by the PUC.
Great. Well, with that, we would love to turn it over to, we just summed this up. All right. We'll turn it over to Q&A, and we would love to answer your questions about our experience or perhaps some interest areas that you guys are pursuing. Kim.
So I wrote down several questions, so I'll try to condense them into a couple meaningful ones. So I think my first question is, how do you recommend, and I'll just say them all at once and then you can answer. How do you recommend local governments keep a pulse on regulatory proceedings that may or may not impact them? Like, I don't think the PUC has a very user-friendly newsletter, so like, what's the way in there? And then to follow up on that, what was the cost for you all to be involved, to hire all that expertise that you needed? And then is that something that you had to work to get council approval on? And given the time-sensitive nature of so many of these proceedings, is that a barrier, or was that is your council already pretty engaged? So a lot of overlapping questions there.
3 pieces of candy.
Oh my God.
I can, and bonus because you saved the PowerPoint, so well done. So I can answer the second question. The first, I don't have a great answer for at the moment, but so our project costs about $250,000. We had those 7 governments participate. We had, again, the technical experts at Synapse Energy Economics. We engaged with them with a not to exceed cost, and the scope of work included everything from analysis and testimony to even them flying out should they have to testify in person, and then our legal counsel. So the reliance that we had on Kaplan Kirsch in this particular example was, I can't even imagine diving into this without their expertise, because it really was the ability for them to stay on top of the one proceeding that we were engaged in, and that really helped just stay on top of the timeline and when things were due and all of that. So that was the scope. And then we ended up uniquely divvying up those costs by local government per GHGs, because we all had GHG inventories and we were like, oh, this is natural gas based, we're gonna divvy it up that way. So usually in other types of IGAs we have with the local governments, we do something around population size or something like that, or maybe tax base. But in this case, we did it by GHG emissions. So
sorry, follow-up question. So higher GHG emitters pay more into the total of $250,000.
Yeah.
I'm curious because you said the 7 communities are made up in the Mountain Community Coalition. Did you open the conversation to Leadville, Kremling, some not so progressive communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did not, and the decision was not so much based on the politics, but rather the project management. we need to act now, this is getting filed, we have a deadline, and we knew that as Summit County governments, we had a strong history of collaboration and intergovernmental agreements anyway. And that was really where the core of the problem was, that the Xcel's application was really focused on that area. Leadville is impacted, Minturn is impacted, and Granby Grand Lake is impacted as well. And Winter Park, I believe, although they were not mentioned very much in Mountain Energy Project, but more broadly speaking, the Eastern Mountain Gas System included those as well.
And the outcome will affect them.
It will, yeah.
How long did you have from when Xcel filed their application until you decided that you wanted to?
Intervene?
Yeah, yes, thanks.
So the formal intervention period that's standard at the PUC is 30 days from the application filing. So if they're doing their job well, there's been outreach to, especially cases like this where there's specific communities that are impacted, there's doing outreach in those communities before they file the application, but the official intervention period is 30 days. I'm not sure how far in advance you all were talking about the coalition.
Yeah, so Kristen, as you know, we have part of the supplemental facilities that we mentioned, and we didn't really dive into that detail, but we have had temporary supplemental facilities of liquefied natural gas in our community since the 2022-23 heating season. So we actually had some of this infrastructure already deployed prior to the application which confuses talk about confusing to the public, like that kind of timeline and process is really challenging. But so because of that negotiation up front, we had some early heads up that this was happening. We really, I remember there was a very specific conversation with the Colorado Energy Office about what intervening at the PUC looks like, and it was right about when the application was filed. So we really did a lot of that all within 30 days. Yeah, in the back.
I'm wondering, what can we do to be able to be aware of these before there's a fire? Because I worked on a project with Evergy in Kansas and Missouri, and we ended up as a consulting company kind of preempting a filing, and it was a lot easier than going through the PUC to work directly with the utility, what their goals were and what the community goals were. I just wondered your thoughts on that, and have you tried that here with Xcel?
In terms of kind of preempting a filing, or so I think it works a little bit differently in every state. In Colorado, I'm not sure that type of arrangement would work for an IOU, for a regulated utility. For municipal utilities or rural electric co-ops, things are a little bit different. But for kind of the Xcel is really the big IOU regulated utility here in electric and gas utility here in Colorado. And for anything they want to recover costs for through rates has to go through the commission approval process.
Woo! And I think the elephant in the room has been these two questions about how do you stay on top of it, and I don't have a good answer for that right now.
I can give it a shot. I mean, here in Colorado, there's organization, and I imagine in many states there's kind of organizations of communities similar to this that are working together formally or less formally on climate and energy issues that often have a greater pulse on what's going on. As Mike mentioned, a lot of at least the kind of bigger planning types of proceedings are regulated or required by statute on some sort of cyclical process or cadence. I think the PUC here, at least the PUC itself, is getting a little bit better at outreach and publicizing, if you know where to look, I guess, on their website, on applications that have been filed. Of course, they don't have any control over when the applications have been filed unless the commission has directed, file your next plan by X date. But it can be difficult. Like, I don't want to minimize that. It does take paying attention. It does take resources and time to kind of know what's going on. I think going back to Mike's points too about the interconnectedness of proceedings, that can help be like, the commission ordered that the next plan of this type be filed by X date. And so you can kind of know to be aware of that, but that requires kind of knowing where to look in the first place too. Do you have additional thoughts?
Well, I don't really have a good answer. I wish I did, because I've talked to PUC staff often about this issue. Like, where can you go just to figure out what kind of proceedings are expected within the next year? And they just don't have it. You know, they say, well, we're working on it, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't happen. So what I've seen with some local governments is that, and this of course depends on staff resources, but they'll have someone on staff who just monitors these things, and then they aren't necessarily a specialist. They bring in outside counsel if necessary, but somebody that just kind of monitors what's going on with the PUC. And part of that, at least what's worked for me, is that there's several staff members at the PUC that I know and have worked with in the past that I just call up periodically or email and say what's important that's going on over the next 3 months. But that's like not a great process, but it's the best that I've been able to come up with.
I think other agencies, for example, the Air Commission does a bit, or the staff for the Air Commission have been doing a better job of like stakeholder meetings in advance of a rulemaking. Those are procedurally different because it's usually the state or the Air Division bringing a rule proposal. So they have more control over the timing and the substance and more advanced notice of that as compared to potentially an application filed by the utility at the PUC. So different agencies really approach it differently. But for the Air Commission, I would say there's more kind of advanced notice, and I do think they do a better job of publicizing that, at least on their website.
And I would just add, here in Colorado, we do have the Colorado Communities for Climate Action, which is a coalition beyond mountain towns, but 46? Yeah, right. See, I'm doing my job, Jacob. 46 local governments that, they have an advocacy director who is also helpful in staying on top of this. And in fact, the CC4CA is an intervening party in the existing GIP, all these fun acronyms, gas infrastructure plan right now, which is also an ongoing proceeding. So I have to say, as a local government staffer who had never done this before, now I have a common language. I at least can understand, I'm not fluent in PUC, but I at least know where to go to even look for this. And I think that's just a step up from where we were before.
I was just curious, I actually live in Arizona, so our corporation commission is really awful, but I outside of Colorado, I was just wondering, are there any like regional or national organizations that you're aware of that are doing advocacy on PUC work in general? Because it seems like pretty non-existent in my state, so I just didn't know if there were any groups that you were aware of that were like helping to influence the PUC work.
Is this a good plug, Jacob, for your next talk? Jacob, do you have an answer to that? Because I don't.
For
do you?
Some states, I don't know if WRA covers Arizona, but Western Resource Advocates
it does,
is one
yeah.
Okay.
multi-state nonprofit
Thank you.
that does this, and there are, depending on the state you're in, there are some other, not necessarily local government groups, but environmental nonprofits that are doing this kind of tracking and this kind of work.
Yeah, I would totally echo that. So Western Resource Advocates is kind of an Intermountain West regional environmental organization who is very involved in the PUC in Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, probably others. And then some of the big national environmental organizations, Sierra Club, NRDC, at least here, SWEEP in the Southwest. Earth Justice is a public interest law firm, nonprofit that often represents community groups or environmental nonprofits in these types of proceedings too.
Sarah?
Hey, so our situation, we have our electric company separate from our gas company, which causes all kinds of other challenges with electrification. But we have a general rate case open right now at the electricity provider. My question for you, or the people in this room, is, by the way, they're proposing 40 cents a kilowatt hour. Can anyone beat that? Okay.
No.
The current rate case proposes to eliminate the distinction now between the permanent and non-permanent rate classes. So for years and years, there's been a distinction because maybe the old math or whatever, maybe it's grandfathered in, that the second homeowners who flux in are essentially responsible for the peak demand and the infrastructure that needs to be built to meet that demand. So actually, I'm very curious, does anyone else in your utilities have a permanent, non-permanent resident distinction on your rates? No? Okay, so, I mean, it's a thing though, right? We all have major second homeowner situations, empty homes, people, they flex in during the holidays, the ski season, and they're responsible for peak demand. Should the residents who live there year round be paying the same when we're not responsible for peak loads? I'm just putting it out there, was just curious, I feel pretty alone right now.
So, well, no, here, so I think that was one of the arguments that one of the particular parties, the one that did not agree to our settlement, was making in terms of, first of all, there are statutory requirements for the utility to start looking at people who cause the additional growth on the gas system to have to pay, right? Like maybe those of us in this room might want to start looking at price signals to get people off gas, right? Like that's a thing that we should be discussing. However, we didn't want to be the guinea pig because we felt like we needed to approach that from a system-wide perspective to really understand that. But then it also came down to the second homeowners, or sort of we call it amenity loads here, but like your additional loads on the gas system that are either from a home that is partially occupied or that has excessive outdoor energy use for one reason or another. And so that definitely played a role in the discussion, and we pushed back and said, whoa, we're not ready, like we need to approach this more holistically. And so we will see those studies come down the pike. But it was absolutely something they pointed to say, you guys are causing this.
But let me add something to that, Jessie, because I think that the coalition's advocacy about the codes that local governments had adopted, and also some of the really good work that the local governments here have done to reduce emissions on their own, really helped mitigate that argument. I mean, we don't know exactly how the commission's going to come out on that, but it was providing at least a partial answer. You know, like the one party that was opposed to the settlement, they just put up a slide of a $17 million house, right? And they said, look at this, you know, and then, but the coalition can put up information about, like, look at all these things that we're doing to reduce the demand. And I think it helped equal out that, so it wasn't such a powerful argument for them.
Thank you for saying that, because we really leaned on the fact that, like, our local codes, we have exceeded the energy code for years, and that should be given credit in the considerations when the utility forecasts the gas demand in the future. Yeah.
Do you have any tips for communicating what governments are doing with these proceedings to the general public?
That might be a stumper.
Yeah. Don't bury people in acronyms, for starters. Sorry. Not really, but one of the things that one of our particular coalition members really pushed for was more public outreach during the proceedings. So the utility consumer advocate, who ironically was the only one that didn't join the settlement as an intervening party, they also help just the general public understand PUC proceedings. And so they came up and did a town hall that was agnostic of their position on the application, but did talk to the public about how to engage. And in fact, it was a very similar discussion as to what we just had here. So that was an opportunity. We did have some folks participate in public comment during the hearings, but even from their comments, it was very clear that there was a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about what was being presented. And so that told us that we needed to be doing more. And so I don't think we have a good answer yet, but it's certainly a place where the coalition members really put time and effort into thinking about how to do better moving forward.
Can you talk a little bit about the reduced rate for heat pumps, what that would look like, and is it residential and commercial?
So there was legislation passed, and I forget what session it was in Colorado, that was going to require the utility to bring forward a rate case by 2027 that looked at this. So the idea of that was already floating around out there. But when we when we've worked with our nonprofit partners to understand barriers to heat pump and electrification, one of the biggest things is that we are a winter peaking grid. And so you end up paying, even though heat pumps are more efficient, when it gets that cold, they're not as efficient, and you end up paying closer to electric resistance heating rate. And so we have a hard time making the cost argument to say it's going to be cheaper year round, right? And so we brought that forward to the utility, and we said, we know that this is a barrier in our community. It might look different than what you're talking to folks on the Front Range about. And so because of that, we're going to have difficulty getting people to adopt heat pumps at the rate needed for this NPA to work if we don't change the rate. And so what can you guys bring forward? And so they're proposing a pilot, which would basically be a year in advance of what they would statutorily be required to do anyway.
And just residential?
Just residential as far as I know, yeah.
Is it like metered differently? Does each house have to get a new meter, or do you know?
I believe it's an opt-in program, kind of like when if you have an EV charger in your home, there's like an opt-in, you like register with the utility, it's an opt-in program. It's not designed yet. I don't know the details.
Yeah, so the Xcel will be bringing a proposal to the commission next summer, or by next summer, on this, and my presumption is that it will be available to a certain number of customers, I think across their service territory, not just in the Eastern Mountain Gas System, who sign up to participate in the initial pilot program.
Matt?
So coalitions are always great, and always also like herding cats at the very beginning of this, particularly in something with a very short timeline. Was there a particular person or position that really got that initial coalition together? And if you can Jessie, Burley.
You're looking at her.
Yeah, so I would say we coalesced around two goals in particular. One was the town of Breckenridge driving the climate argument, and then the fact that all of the coalition governments have a shared document that has the same goals. So that was the first one. So Breck kind of drove that one, and then Summit County government drove the affordability concerns. And so those two issues together really, and those were the two biggest GHG emitters. So even if nobody else joined on the bandwagon, it would have been the two largest governments moving forward, probably with the coalition. We did things a little bit backwards, and maybe this is a little TMI, but we did our intergovernmental agreements for the coalition like after we had filed the motion to intervene. And so we were like, we got to get on this first, and we moved really quickly that way, and then we did the intergovernmental housekeeping after the fact. So I was a little backwards, but it was because of that, we had to be nimble to be able to participate.
And I think kind of from the outside council perspective, like having Jessie as kind of the point person for the coalition, and of course we engaged with everybody in the coalition and had conversations, but really having one point person in proceedings that are moving quickly made our job a lot easier. So really appreciative of someone herding the cats.
It is herding cats, though. It's very, truly. I am happy to stay and answer further questions, but it sounds like people are regrouping for the next session. Thank you guys so much for attending. Thank you.